the appellant is often at a disadvantage because he or she does not have equal access to information, equality of arms, including previous decisions of appeals officers. Flack also said, add to this the excessive delay at this appeal stage and the potential for inconsistency in decision making. And we conclude that the current process does not provide an effective remedy. It simply doesn't work. Now, Flack had sought similar access to similar decisions as the cases they were fighting. However, these were refused as the Social Welfare Appeals Office did not have a searchable database of decisions. But the Social Welfare Appeals Office does have a searchable database of decisions. But it is only for the state and legal people they choose to give it to. And it's not for anybody else. It is a secret database. Appellants to the Social Welfare Appeals Office, people who are appealing scope decisions, are rarely Mr. or Mrs. Average Citizen. These are high roller companies with millions to lose if scope decisions for their workers are upheld by the Social Welfare Appeals Office. These companies come to the Appeals Office armed to the teeth. Senior counsel, junior counsel, solicitors, legal representatives, and industry representatives regularly accompany these high roller appellants, and they are high rollers. The poor schmuck worker who was found to be an employee and not self-employed by scope, also a legally binding decision by the way, is forced into the appeals office like a lamb to the slaughter. The worker is downgraded to a notice party, has no entitlement to legal representation, and is threatened by the appeals office with a €1,500 fine for non-appearance. Now, that letter from the Revenue Commissioners to the PAC fails to reveal the full facts about these cases he was talking about. In 93-94, 2 couriers were selected by courier companies for assessment by the scope section. Both were found to be employees. Decisions were appealed to the Social Welfare Appeals Office by the courier company representatives and the individuals, identical to the Denny case. The Department of Social, Community and Family Affairs was the defendant, because it always is in these cases. It must defend the scope decision. By the time the appeal came around in 1995, one of the couriers had emigrated. Documents in the company's office show that the other courier had become a director of a courier company in the intervening period. Nevertheless, the appeal went ahead and the scope decision was overturned. In reality, this single case should not have had any impact on the employment status of other couriers, even though it was crooked as be damned. There was no legally justifiable reason to believe that this secret case held in a secret court between courier company owner-directors and the state could become a defining test case for every genuine courier. In 1993-94, Scope had made the decision based on their own individual merits in accordance with the general precedents of Irish law. They were not test cases. Scope did not view them as test cases. In the 95 appeal of the Scope decision, the appeals officer claimed that his decision was of wider significance to the trade. Well, it was only the trade sitting in the appeal at the time. Of course it had wider significance to the trade. Skip forward to the secret tax deal in the Burlington, where Revenue stated that the use of the 95 appeal decision as a justification to classify all couriers as self-employed was a non-binding decision that does not override the rights of couriers. The final metamorphosis of this single decision came from the Secretary General of the Department of Social, Community and Family Affairs. In his reply to the inquiries from the PAC, the Secretary General outright called the single 95 appeal decision a number of test cases. Now, in later years, the company representative told the EAT that these cases, which social welfare are calling test cases, he said they were inconclusive. They were never test cases. Less than 1 month after the letter to the PAC from the the chairman of the Revenue Commissioners, the insurability decision from the scope section in my case came through. I was an employee. Like I'd said all along, I was an employee. This was an emphatic decision. The indicators, 14-3 in my favour. Emphatic decision, a slam dunk. The secret tax deal from the Burlington Hotel lay in tatters. Not worth the paper it was written on. The futile attempt to shoehorn all couriers into self-employment based on one decision alone had backfired spectacularly. If the prospect of having to reclassify all couriers as employees didn't cause sphincters to slam shut, a one-line memo from the scope section to the relevant social welfare inspector sure did. It instructed, deal with it, compliance. Deal with compliance. Compliance means that the social welfare has to credit me with every stamp and entitlement that I was owed for being an employee back to year dot. Social welfare then has to chase down the company for it. I was there 3 years. Some guys were there 15 years. And that's not uncommon in industries that use these PAYE systems for self-employed workers. The company immediately appealed the case to the Social Welfare Appeals Office. I mean, that was totally expected. They refused to supply reasons for appeal. Now, the appeal was accepted by the Social Welfare Appeals Office, despite the lack of written reasons for appeal. On the 12th of April 2001, Mr. Jerome Flanagan, Secretary to the Chairman of the Public Accounts Committee, wrote to me. Jerome enclosed an article from the Revenue Commissioner's publication, Tax Briefing, Issue 43, April 2001. The article contained a report on the ESG. Now, this is the ESG. The article was introducing the code of practice to the wider population. And that's what it was doing. But Jerome wrote, I believe its contents may be of interest to you in light of the case you yourself are making. In fact, I believe your case was one which gave rise to the group's formation, and I know it was certainly discussed at some of the group's meetings. It was discussed. The only reason the ESG existed was because of the case I was making. The Employment Status Group was formed to create circumstances where the Social Welfare Appeals Office process would be affected by direction from Revenue, IBEC, Enterprise Trade and Employment, Social Welfare and Finance. The explicit understanding was that the precedents set in the Denny case would be ignored. Even before the scope decision in my case, the possibility of a devastating financial impact to courier companies and the knock-on effect across countless other businesses had prompted unprecedented collusion at the very highest levels of state, industry and unions to prevent this change in the status quo. Pandora's box was well and truly open, and the speed with which non-compliant employers and state authorities moved to close it was truly breathtaking. The first evidence of this collusion was exposed in the letter from the Revenue Commissioner to the chairman of the PAC. This stated, The issue of couriers was also raised at the recent inaugural meeting of the Employment Status Group set up under the auspices of the Programme for Prosperity and Fairness. And it goes on to list the people who were there. Now, it doesn't list the NUJ, who were also invited and attended. The Employment Status Group itself claims that the group was set up because of a growing concern that there may be increased numbers of individuals categorised as self-employed when the indicators may be that employee status would be more appropriate. In other words, it was set up to check, should these people be employees? Jerome's letter confirmed what I already suspected. I'd requested an insurability of employment decision from the scope section in July 2000. Shortly after, a courier company representative requested and was refused an off-the-record meeting with Scope. Scope weren't having any trucking with these people. They were making their decision based on the available evidence. A few weeks later, in August 2000, the chairman of the Revenue Commissioners was actually able to write to the Public Accounts Committee and tell them that the issue of couriers was being discussed by an employment status group. So even though Scope refused to speak to them, they still got their off-the-record meeting, and this time much higher up the food chain. All of this happened while the Scope decision in my case was sub judice. It took 51 days from the time of receipt of the request to the 6th of December 2000 when the decision was issued, and in this short period, IBEC, ICTU, Finance, Revenue and Social Community and Family Affairs had met and discussed my specific case. Nowhere in the Revenue Commissioner's tax briefing, issue 43, is this mentioned. Sometime later, I managed to obtain the real hidden agenda of the Employment Status Group. I got it from the Communication Workers Union, who had been present at all the meetings. Now, they said the main task was to get those represented around the table to engage in a constructive look at the whole issue of employment status and to progress towards some criteria which would resolve the issue. This was a difficult task, as generally the view of IBEC, Finance and Revenue was that the status quo should remain.